Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen, wassalatu wassalamu ala sayyidil ashrafil anbiya wal mursaleen, sayyidina Muhammadin wa ala alihi wa ashabihi ajma'in. Amma ba'd, fa'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajim. Bismillahir rahmanir rahim. We will begin this week's lesson number 15, by looking at the chapter or the section which deals with infrequent bleeding of women, known in Arabic as istihada. Now there are 5 ways where you can identify bleeding of women to be of istihada. Now the 5 ways are: number 1, any bleeding which is not from the womb. So any bleeding which is not from the womb in Arabic is called istihada. So I will just give you an example. Just say if a woman, she cut herself somewhere near her private part. So the blood which she is seeing or experiencing, that is not period blood. It is not postnatal bleeding, it is not nifas, but instead that bleeding will be considered as istihada, surplus blood or any kind of infrequent bleeding. Another way to determine whether it is istihada bleeding or not is if a woman bleeds more than the maximum days of haid or less than the maximum days of haid. So haid, period bleeding, and I mentioned this in last week's lesson and also the week before, that the maximum number of days a woman can be on a period for is 10 days. So if a woman, say for example, bleeds for 12 days, more than the maximum period, then the extra 2 days will be considered as istihada. Or just say, for example, again, this was mentioned a couple of weeks ago, the minimum number of days a woman can be on a period for is 3 days. So if she bleeds, say, for 24 hours or 48 hours, and then the bleeding stops, then the 2 days she was bleeding for would not be considered as haid or periods, which is preventing her from salah and from fasting, but instead those 2 days will be considered as istihada. Similarly, another way to determine whether this bleeding is of istihada or of something else is if her bleeding commences or starts within 15 days of a previous haid or from a previous period. Because as I mentioned again in last week's lesson, that there has to be a gap of 15 days from the ending of one haid and one period from then to the next starting one. So if within those 2 time days there has been a gap of less than 15 days, then that bleeding which she experiences will be called istihada. So again, these examples were given in last week's lesson, such as if she stopped her bleeding on the 10th of January, so the next time, according to the laws of the Sharia, where she should start her period, she doesn't have to, but the minimum date when she will start her next period will be from the 25th of January or afterwards. So if she now starts bleeding before 25th of January, then that bleeding which she experiences will be called istihada. Also, another way to derive whether it is istihada is if a woman or a girl bleeds or experiences bleeding before the age of 9. Because before the age of 9, let's say if a girl at the age of 6, 7, 8, she sees some bleeding, then that bleeding would not be called hayd, would not be called period, but we will call that istihada. And similarly, if a woman experiences bleeding after the age of 55, because as the scholars have said, that it is from the age of 55, that's when a woman gets into her menopause. So if after the age of 55, 56, 57, say for example, she sees some bleeding or she experiences bleeding, then that bleeding will be called istihada and not hayd. And also remember, another way to derive istihada bleeding is that any bleeding which a woman experiences while she is pregnant. When a woman is pregnant, her hayd stops, her period stops for 9 months. So any kind of bleeding she experiences while she is pregnant is not called hayd, is not even called nifas, postnatal bleeding, which we're going to look at later, but instead these blood or bleeding, we will classify them to be istihada. So these are the 5-6 ways which I mentioned where you can derive istihada bleeding. Now what is the ruling of istihada? What does istihada do? So let's have a look at the text. The author Imam Quduri rahmatullahi says that وَدَمُ الْإِسْتِحَادَةِ هُوَ مَا تَرَاهُ الْمَرْأَةُ أَقَلَّ مِنْ 3 أَيَّامٍ أَوْ أَكْثَرَ مِنْ 10 أَيَّامٍ, which means that any bleeding which a woman experiences for less than 3 days or more than 10 days. Because as I've already explained, the minimum period for hayd and for period is 3 days and the maximum is 10 days. So if a woman just sees bleeding or experiences bleeding for a couple of days or for 12, 13 days, then the extra 3 days or the 2 days which she has experienced in bleeding, then that will be classified or considered as istihada. Now this is the ruling here. Now the ruling is فَحُكْمُهَا حُكْمُ الرُّعَى, that a woman who experiences these extra or surplus blood or bleeding, her hukum or her status is that of someone who's got a nosebleed. The word ru'at in Arabic means someone who's got a nosebleed. Now obviously if someone's got a nosebleed, does that prevent him from his obligation? Does that prevent him from the ritual? So the answer is no. So exactly same with the woman who's experiencing these kind of irregular bleeding patterns, who's experiencing bleeding before less than 3 days or more than 10 days, then her ruling or her status is لا يمنع الصلاة ولا الصوم, that it does not prevent her from reading namaz and from fasting. And this is the key difference between women who are suffering irregular bleeding patterns and from a woman who's in her period. Because a woman who's in a hayd or period, it is unlawful and haram for her to read namaz. It is unlawful and haram for her to fast. However, a woman who is experiencing these kind of irregular bleeding, or when she's not supposed to be bleeding, she's bleeding, or she's pregnant and she's seeing some blood, then as the text says, لا يمنع الصلاة ولا الصوم, it does not prevent her from namaz and it does not prevent her from fasting. i.e., it is still obligatory for her to read namaz and it is still obligatory for her to fast. Now some of you may be thinking that how can she read namaz if she's bleeding? Because sometimes these women, when they have these kind of irregular bleeding patterns, they kind of will bleed for a long amount of time. So how can they pray salah even though they're bleeding? So this is a section which we're going to look at later on under the section of ma'zur. Someone who's a ma'zur or who has chronic illness, says then how would he pray his namaz? So this is something which we're going to look at in the next probably 10-15 minutes or so. The next text goes on to say, وَلَا الْوَطْيَ, and it does not prevent her from having intercourse. So a woman who is suffering these kind of irregular bleeding, then it is not haram for her, or it is not unlawful for her to have sexual intercourse. Again, we mentioned this a couple of weeks ago, that if a woman who is in a period or who is experiencing postnatal bleeding nifas, then it is unlawful and haram for her husband to have intercourse with her. However, with regards to a woman who's on istihada, who's suffering irregular bleeding patterns, or for example, as I mentioned, she's pregnant and she sees some blood, or she's on her menopause and she sees bleeding, so all these things does not prevent her from her prayers, from her obligations, and also if the husband wants, he can have sexual intercourse with her. The next few lines of Quduri is indicating towards a masla or a ruling which we have already looked at. If you cast your mind back a few weeks ago, I mentioned that there are three types of women who you can classify experiencing period blood. And the three types of women, their technical names which are given in Arabic are a mubtadiya, number two, a mu'tada, and number three, a mutahayyira. And I mentioned that a mu'tada is someone who is aware of her habit, and if this woman now bleeds for more than a habit, but if it is less than 10 days, then the number of days she bled for, that will be her new adat and her new habit for the next month. However, if she bled more than her habit and also more than 10 days, then what her previous habit was, we will act upon that, and the extra 5 or 6 days, whatever it is, we will consider that to be istihada and surface bleeding, which will not prevent her from salah, from observing fast, and from the husband having sexual intercourse with her. So just to recap, I'll just give you an example. Just say if a woman or a sister, her adat or her habit is that she bleeds for 7 days every month. That's a habit. And just to make it easy, just say the first 7 days of every month, she's on a period. So this sister, say for the month of January, she bled for 7 days, but she also experienced bleeding on the 8th day and also on the 9th day. So before the 10 days, up to the 10 days, she sees some bleeding. Now the ruling will be that for the month of February, the next month, her adat and her habit will now change. And for the month of February, we will consider her adat and her habit to be of 9 days. So that will be her new habit from the month of February and so on. Now going back to the same sister again, just say for example, her adat and her habit is 7 days, but during the month of January, she bled more than 7 days and also more than 10 days. So she experienced bleeding on the 8th, 9th, 10th, and just say all the way up to 12 days. So for this sister now, the ruling is that her habit will remain the same for the next month, and that is 7 days. And the extra 5 days she experienced bleeding from day 7 all the way until day 12, those extra 5 days will be classified or considered as istihada, considered as surface blood. And obviously, if she did not read her prayers or namaz during those 5 days, then she will have to do qaza for those prayers. If she missed any fast, then obviously she will have to do qaza for the fast as well. So that will be the ruling. So this is something which the author is going to mention from the next line or so, where he says, وَإِذَا زَادَ الدَّمُ عَلَى الْعَشْرَةِ وَلِلْمَرْأَةِ عَادَةٌ مَعْرُوفَةٌ, that if the bleeding exceeds more than 10 days, وَلِلْمَرْأَةِ عَادَةٌ مَعْرُوفَةٌ. And this woman has a known habit. The word ma'rufa means that she knows the habit. Then what is the ruling? رُدَّتْ إِلَىٰ أَيَّامِ عَادَتِهَا. We will now refer or revert back to her adat and her habit. So if she bled all the way until 12 days or 13 days, and she's got a known habit of say 7 days, so what's going to happen? رُدَّتْ إِلَىٰ أَيَّامِ عَادَتِهَا. We will now revert back to her habit. So what is the habit? 7 days, we will classify that to be period and haze, and the extra 5, 6, 7 days, whatever it may be, that will be classified as istihada. And then the next text then goes on to say, وَإِنِ ابْتَدَعَتْ مَعَ الْبُلُوغِ مُسْتَحَاضَةً فَهَيْدُهَا 10 أَيَّامٍ مِنْ كُلِّ شَهْرٍ وَالْبَاقِي استihادة. And the next ruling again is something which I highlighted at the very beginning of this section, where I mentioned that there may be some girls, young girls, who are experiencing haze for the very first time. So obviously they don't have a set habit from before. A woman who's been having periods for a while, then obviously she's already developed her adat and her habit that every month she bleeds for X number of days. But for a young girl who is having periods for the very first time in her life, so the question arises that how will she calculate her habit? How does she know that, or how long does she have to refrain from praying salah and refrain from fasting? So the ruling is that for a girl who is experiencing haze and periods for the very first time, we will say that her habit and her adat is for 10 days. Okay? So up to 10 days, we will consider that to be her haze and her period, and anything extra will be considered as istihaza and will be considered as surplus blood. And obviously, just say if it's a young girl, and generally speaking, they are healthy and so on, so they will bleed for say 6, 7 days, and that 7 days will be her habit for the next month, and then the next month, and so on. But sometimes there may be occasions where these young girls, they may actually bleed for more than 10 days. So therefore the ruling will be that up to 10 days we will consider that to be haze and period, and anything extra will be considered as surplus. Now the next ruling takes me on to what I promised 5-10 minutes ago, and that is with regards to someone who are ma'zur, someone who have chronic illnesses, and how would they pray their salah, and how would they go about, what are the rituals, what things should they do when it comes to purification and tahara. Now what do I mean by the word ma'zur, or someone who's got a chronic illness? Now chronic illness basically means that someone who's got this kind of illness where he cannot remain in the state of wudu or taharat or purity for a long time. Basically, just say some people, they have a gas problem. They've got a wind problem. So they're always passing wind. Sometimes people, they've got this urine problem where they cannot keep hold of the urine. And there's always drops of urine coming out of their private parts. Some people, they have, again, semen problems where, again, drops of semen or this kind of liquid comes out from their private part, which we call it, as I mentioned before, as wad. So these kind of things happen. And you'll be surprised, especially nowadays, for men in particular, it's actually quite bad. A lot of men actually email me at Darul Ifta and saying, we've got this problem, we can't hold on to our wuzu, I'm always leaking out urine, leaking out semen and so on. So what should I do when it comes to namaz? What should I do when it comes to wudu? And so on and so forth. So especially nowadays, a lot of men are actually finding this as a problem and are experiencing this kind of difficulty. So the question arises that what happens when it comes to their taharat and when it comes to their purity? There are some who think that actually people, they always like to look for an excuse So sometimes people who are suffering from these kind of illnesses, they say, oh well, I've got this problem, I can't read namaz because I can't hold on to my wudu. But the beauty of the Sharia is that there is always alternatives, there are always substitutes, there are always options and alternatives available for you to get out of a predicament or for you to get out of a hole. And this is what the Sharia has told us, the following rulings which I'm going to mention, where a person can still or is still obliged to pray his salah by slightly changing and altering the rules with regards to taharat and purification. Now, the key word here, or the word which is used in the Arabic text, is the word ma'zur. And the person, he becomes a ma'zur when a whole duration of namaz time passes without him having enough time where he can do the 4 fara'id of wudu and read the 4 fara'id, or depending on which namaz he is, and read the fara'id of the salah. So just say, for example, a person, he's got a nosebleed. And this nosebleed is so bad that he's just dripping blood. It's like he's put tissue there, he can't stop it. He's blown his nose out, even then he can't stop the bleeding. And this has been going on for one duration namaz. Like for one complete namaz time, this has been going on. So therefore that person now will be considered as a ma'zur. So I'll just give you examples. Just say Asr, which is a very short time. So just say Asr time starts at 3 o'clock and it finishes at 4:15. So at 3 o'clock, or just say before 3 o'clock, at 2:55, he was like playing football or he was doing some kind of activities and he cut himself and he's now bleeding. So just before 3 o'clock, when Asr time starts at 3, so just before 3 o'clock, he started bleeding. And this bleeding has continued, all the way up till 4:15. So this person now is considered as a ma'zur. Now it doesn't mean that that asr for that day is forgiven. What he will do is that just say 5 minutes before, say around 4:10, what will he now do is that even though he's bleeding, he will do wudu and he will pray the fara'id of the namaz. So just say asr namaz, 4 rakats are first, so he will read the 4 rakats first. Even though he's bleeding, he will read the 4 rakats first. But because that particular chronic illness, i.e. being in the state of impurity and bleeding, has lasted for one complete namaz time and for one complete prayer time, so now for the next namaz, he is now considered as a ma'zur. So what will now happen is that from the next namaz onwards, if he is still in that particular state where he is bleeding, he will be allowed to pray salah, do wuzu and pray salah, even though he is bleeding. Or if he's got a gas problem or a wind problem, he will be allowed to pray salah, even though wind is coming out. Or if he's got a semen problem or a drop problem or urine problem, so he'll be allowed to pray namaz, even though urine is coming out, even though semen is coming out. So that is the ruling with regards to a ma'zur person. And the same rule also applies for women who have this surplus bleeding or who are istihada, that they may be bleeding at irregular times. But if their bleeding is such that it is continuous and it lasts for one namaz time, for one complete namaz time, so what will now happen is that for every namaz time, they will just do wudu and they will pray the namaz even though blood may be coming out from their wound, even though they may be passing wind, even though semen or urine may be coming out. So that is the ruling and the regulations with regards to a ma'zur person. Now there's a couple of things which needs to be highlighted here. The first thing which we're going to look at is the ma'zur's clothing. That there may be someone who's bleeding. Now if he's bleeding just if he's bleeding from the wound, what's going to now happen is that the blood is going to come onto his clothes. So the question arises is that how is he going to pray his namaz when there are blood patches on his clothes? Now the ruling with regards to ma'zur's clothing is as follows, that if his udhr or if his illness is so severe that it is not possible for him to pray the fara'id of the namaz, whether it's 4 rakats, 2 rakats or 3 rakats, without the illness or without the wound or the bleeding coming onto his clothes, then he will be allowed to pray the salah even though there may be blood on his clothes. Just an example, like he's got this really bad wound or cut where there's a lot of blood coming out. So now, if the bleeding or wound is so severe that it's always bleeding and large chunks of blood is coming out, then in that situation he will be allowed to pray the salah even though he's bleeding. However, just say for example, if his cut or his wound, he's got a wound and blood is coming out, but it's coming out slowly, bit by bit. Obviously, even if blood comes out, as we looked at before, even though it's a bit, your wudu breaks. So this person has got a wound or a cut, but the bleeding which is coming out is like bit by bit, little bit at a time. Then in that situation, he'll be allowed to read salah with those clothing with the condition that the bleeding cannot be more than a size of a 50 pence coin, known in Arabic as a dirham. So it can't be more than a dirham. Obviously these rulings we're going to look at later on in the next section when we're going to look at if you have blood on your clothes and how to get rid of it and so on. But that is more or less the ruling and what we should know at this moment in time. And that is that if the illness or the udhr isn't that severe, then he can read namaz with those clothing as long as the blood from the wound doesn't reach a 50 pence coin or the size of a dirham on his clothes. So that is one ruling. The second ruling here is that if someone who is a ma'zur, can he lead the prayer? So someone who's got like a gas problem or a wind problem, then can he actually lead the prayer and become an imam for those people who don't have these issues or who don't have these illnesses? So the ruling in the Hanafi fiqh is that someone who is a ma'zur, he cannot be the imam. Whether it is first prayers or whether it is sunnah or nafil prayers such as tarawih salah. Because some people of the view, and it's not actually mentioned in any Hanafi books by the way, but I think some people just mistakenly of the assumption that, okay, I've got this udhr, I've got this gas problem or wind problem, so I can't lead the first prayer, but I can lead the tarawih prayer. When you actually look through the books of fiqh such as Al-Hidayah and so on, it quite clearly says that someone who is a ma'zur, he cannot lead the prayer of those who are ghair ma'zur, those who don't have these issues and these problems. So irrespective of whether it is the first prayer or whether it is a sunnah or a nafil prayer. So that is the second ruling here. And the third ruling which I want to highlight here, which you could say is similar to a ma'zur person, is nowadays you have old people, they have what you call a stool bag with them, where they've got a bag inside their, well not in their body, but like on their body. And because they've got this kind of bladder problem or this issue of udhr where something impure is always coming out. So what happens is that these pipes are linked with their private parts, so whenever they require to urinate and so on, or something comes out, you will go through this pipe and into this stool bag. Now the question is that, can they pray the salah with carrying this stool bag? So the ruling or the masla is that yes, it will be permissible for them to read or observe salah carrying a stool bag. Obviously, don't get me wrong, if they don't have these, if they are not ma'zur, meaning that if the illness isn't that frequent that it's always coming, then obviously as soon as they urinate or as soon as something comes out from their private part, their wuzu breaks and they will have to redo the wuzu. But the question which I asked and I kind of answered was that can they actually read salah carrying a stool bag where inside the bag there is some urine and there is some stool or feces? So the answer is that is allowed. Obviously it doesn't mean that in namaz you can actually urinate and start having poo or something like that. I'm not actually saying that. But obviously the ruling is actually carrying the stool bag whether you're allowed to read namaz or not. So the answer is that yes, it is permissible. So if you have a look at the text, the author mentions, well, mustahadatu, that's a woman who's experiencing istihada, and someone who's got salasul bawl, i.e. someone who's got this strip problem, where urine is always coming out, وَالرُّعَافُ الدَّائِمُ, or someone who's got a nosebleed, bleeding from his nose, or an injury, الَّذِي لَا يَرْفَعُ, which is not healing. So a person who's got a wound or a gash, and blood is always coming out. So for such an individual, يَتَوَضَّعُونَ لِوَقْتِ كُلِّ صَلَاةٍ, that he will do wudu for each namaz time. Not for each prayer, but for each namaz time. So for example, for Zuhr prayer, he will just make a wudu, and with that Zuhr wudu, he will be able to read بِذَلِكَ الْوُضُوءِ فِي الْوَقْتِ مَا شَاءُ مِنَ الْفَرَائِضِ وَالنَّوَافِلِ. So he can read as much first prayers or as much optional prayers he wants. So it doesn't mean that for every prayer you have to make fresh wudu. It means for every namaz time you will have to make a fresh wudu. So for Zuhr you will make a fresh wudu, Asr you will make a fresh wudu, Maghrib and Isha and Fajr and so on and so forth. And during that time, to say from Zuhr all the way till Asr, so during those 2 hours, 2.5 hours, you can read as many first prayers you want, qaza prayers you can read as many optional and sunnat prayers you want. And then he goes on to say, فَإِذَا خَرَجَ الْوَقْتُ بَطَلَ وُضُوءُهُمْ وَكَانَ عَلَيْهِمْ إِسْتِنَاقُ الْوُضُوءِ لِلصَّلَاةِ الْأُخْرَى. And when the time passes, so just say you made a fresh wudu for the Zuhr prayer, so when the Zuhr prayer finishes and the Asr time comes, then by the Asr time coming, your previous wudu has broken and it will now be obligatory and wajib for you to make a fresh wudu for the Asr prayer, and this is how the practice will continue until you become better. Now the next section which we're going to start is with regards to nifas and postnatal bleeding. Now remember one golden rule with regards to postnatal bleeding, and that is that postnatal bleeding or nifas or the relevant rules and regulations start after the delivery of the child. So when the child is being delivered. Okay, so after the child, as we're going to look at later, after the child comes out, then from there the bleeding you experience or the woman experiences will be considered as nifas. Now any bleeding which a woman experiences or sees in the state of labor or before childbirth is not considered as nifas. Is not considered as postnatal bleeding. Sometimes a woman, she can be in labor for many hours. Just say, for example, if a woman, she gets into labor at 12 o'clock in the afternoon, and she's in labor, say, for 4 hours, all the way until Maghrib time. And she sees some bleeding, but the child's head, say, for example, hasn't come out. So that bleeding which the woman sees, that is not considered as nifas. It's considered as istihada. So therefore, after she comes out from the hospital and after she becomes pure from a postnatal bleeding, the 2 prayers which she has missed, because remember she was in labor from 12 till 4, so just say she missed 2 prayers, Zuhr and Asr, she will have to do qaza of them afterwards. And this is where a lot of sisters actually get mixed up and they get muddled up and they think that any bleeding which I see during the labor is actually nifas. That's not entirely true. Okay, the nifas rules and regulations start after the head of the baby, when it comes out from the womb, when it starts coming out, and any bleeding which she starts experiencing, that is nifas, that is postnatal bleeding. Anything before that, that is not considered as postnatal bleeding. Now, just a few rules which we need to look at with regards to postnatal bleeding. Similar to what I mentioned in the section which dealt with women's period blood, there are also three types of women when it comes to postnatal bleeding. Number one is a mubtadi'ah, number two is a mu'tada, and number three is a mutahayyira. I'm just going to very briefly mention some rulings with regards to them. We're going to start off with mubtadi'ah. Now, mubtadi'ah basically means a woman who is having her first child. Now, as we're going to look at later, the maximum period a woman can be in nifas for is for 40 days. And this woman or sister is having her very first child, so she doesn't know which habit to go with. So for that particular woman, there are some relevant rulings, or there are some special and different rulings. Now the rulings is, basically, she will be in the state of nifas for however many days it may be, all the way up to day 40. So it could be, and a woman who's in her nifas or postnatal bleeding, every day she will kind of experience some kind of bleeding. So every day she sees blood, that will mean that she's in nifas, she's in postnatal bleeding. And that will last all the way up to the 40th day. Now when a woman, say for example, remember this is a woman who's got no habit from before, this is the very first time she's having a child. Now sometimes what may happen is that a woman, she stops bleeding, say after 20 days. She stops bleeding. Now, just because you stop bleeding, it doesn't necessarily mean that your nifas has stopped. What you have to do is that after the woman has stopped her bleeding, she will have to wait for 15 days before you can say that the last bleeding, where the bleeding stopped, the last day when she experienced bleeding, was nifas. I'll just give you an example. Just say for a woman, she bled for 20 days, and then she didn't see any bleeding all the way up to the 35th day. So now the rule is that her nifas or her postnatal bleeding was up to day 20. Was up to the 20th day. Now just say for example, if a woman, she sees bleeding up to the 20th day, and then within 15 days, she sees some more bleeding. So just say for example, she saw blood all the way up till 20 days, and then on the 25th day, so for 21st, 22nd, 23rd, all the way up to 25th day, there was no bleeding at all. Then on the 25th, she saw some bleeding, and then it stopped. So what will that mean is that her habit now has kind of gone up to the 25th day. So we will now consider 25 days to be her nifas, to be her postnatal bleeding. So that is the ruling when it comes to a woman who is having a child for the very first time. Now as I explained before, that for a woman to wait 15 days is actually quite a long time, because just say for example, we afterwards find out that this woman nifas stopped on the 20th day, then that will then mean that she will have to do qadha for 15 days straight, so which is like quite a lot on the margin. So as I explained before, that a woman naturally has this kind of feeling when her bleeding stops. A woman kind of naturally knows that she thinks on this day, I think my bleeding has stopped. So therefore, when she gets that feeling, or as we explained in Urdu, ihsas, that her bleeding has stopped, then she should actually start the namaz. Okay, she should actually start reading her namaz and so on. And obviously, if by chance, if her bleeding does come back, then obviously the prayers which she had read will be considered as invalid and not accepted, because that will mean that she was in a nifas. And obviously, if her bleeding doesn't come back, then the prayers which she had read will be considered valid and accepted. So that is one ruling with regards to Muqtadiya. Then the second woman is a woman who is a Mu'tada, who has children before, and she has already developed a habit. So therefore, the next time when she has a child, then whatever her habit was for the first child, that will be applied for the second child. So just say when she had a first child, she bled for 25 days. So her habit when she has the next child will be 25 days. And when she has the third child, then that will be 25 days, and so on and so forth. And you know the rulings which are mentioned with regards to haid, they also apply to nifas to a certain extent. I don't want to go into too depth, but just say for example, if a woman, she had a child, the very first child she bled for 25 days. Now when she had a second child, she then bled, but she bled for more than 25 days, but her bleeding stopped less than 40 days. Less than the maximum period of nifas. So just say, for example, she bled more than 25 days, but she stopped her bleeding on the 38th day. Now, if she now in the future has a third child, her habit now will be 38 days and not 25 days. Like we did with the masla regarding periods and haid. And the same also goes vice versa as well, that if it kind of decreases, that when she had a second child, the habit was supposed to be 25 days, but she stopped bleeding after 15 days. Then when she has the third child, then her new habit will be 15 days. And the same rule also applies if her bleeding was to exceed more than 40 days. So just say if her habit was 25 days, and then she bled more than 40 days, like she bled up to 45 days, then we will now revert back to her habit, and that would be 25 days, and the extra 20 days bleeding she experienced or saw, that will be considered as istihaza and surplus blood. And then the third category of a woman who's got nifas is a woman who has forgotten her habit. Mutahayyira basically means a woman who's forgotten her habit in nifas. Like for example, when she had the very first child, so she's forgotten how many days. And sometimes it does happen with women, that when they have the first child, they actually have forgotten how many days they had nifas for, whether it was 25 days, 28 days. In particular, if there has been a long gap between having one child and the next child. Let's say if they had one child and the second child they're having is 10 years later, so sometimes a woman, she may have forgotten her habit of nifas when she had the first child. So in that situation, the ruling is that the scholars have said that when she has the second child, she should treat it as she is having the first child. So all the rules regarding muqtadi'ah will apply, and that is that up to 40 days, we will consider that to be nifas and so on. So that is the ruling with regards to that. We'll just finish off this week's lesson by looking at a very important masla and ruling. We've kind of derived very easily what types of bleeding are haid, what types are nifas, and what types of bleeding are istihaza. But there are some situations where it becomes difficult for us to ascertain whether it is haid, or whether it is postnatal bleeding, or whether it is istihaza. And in particular, this problem arises when a woman has an abortion, or if she has a miscarriage. I'm not going to go into the ruling with regards to abortion here. This is something which we're going to look at when we start the marriage section, which is coming up later. I'll kind of elaborate a bit more in that particular section. But just very briefly, to have an abortion after 120 days is something which is strictly haram and unlawful in Islam. And the reason why is that after 120 days, the soul is put into that womb or into that fetus, and by having an abortion is like you're murdering an unborn child, which is obviously killing, murdering is something which is unlawful and haram in Islam. And similar to have an abortion before 120 days is also unlawful and haram as well. However, in certain situations, it becomes permissible and allowed. Now, just very briefly, what is the ruling with regards to the bleeding? If a woman has an abortion or a miscarriage after 4 months, 120 days, the bleeding she will now experience will be considered as nifas. Because remember, after 4 months, it's like you've got a child there. It's like a human being. So if you now take it out, have an abortion, or you have a miscarriage, now in that situation, the bleeding which the woman will experience will be considered as nifas, and the rulings regarding nifas will apply. Now if a woman has a miscarriage before 4 months, or before 120 days, then the rules with regards to hayd and istihada will apply. So just for example, if a woman, she had a miscarriage less than 4 months, then any bleeding she sees, so if it's up to 10 days, then we will consider that to be hayd, we will consider that to be period blood. And if any bleeding she experiences more than 10 days or less than 3 days, then that will be considered or classified as istihada. So that is the ruling with regards to women who have abortion or miscarriages before 4 months, that we will apply the rules which have been laid down with regards to women who are in their period and istihada. And if a woman has a miscarriage or abortion after 4 months, after 120 days, then the rulings which have been laid down regarding nifas and postnatal bleeding, that will apply. Inshallah, we will leave it there for this week. May Allah so give the tawfiq to act on has been said. Wa akhiru da'wan alhamdulillah.
Be a student of knowledge.